My brother was dying in hospice. Across the hall, an old woman had no visitors. I brought her muffins and talked with her. The night before my nephew arrived, she grabbed my arm and whispered, "Drive home tonight if you can." I want to tell you who my brother Dennis was before I tell you what almost happened in that facility, because who he was matters. It matters to the story, and it matters to me. And I've spent enough time watching people reduce him to a set of assets and a signature line that I want to put the actual man on record first. Dennis Ray Calloway was 61 years old when he died. He was 4 years older than me, which meant that for the first decade of my life, he was the person I measured everything against. He was the one who got good grades, so I tried to get good grades. He made the baseball team, so I tried out for the baseball team. I spent about 30 years trying to catch up to my brother before I understood that catching up wasn't the point and never had been. He wasn't running a race. He was just living and living well. He built the lake house himself. That's the part that gets me every time I think about it. He wasn't a contractor by trade. He was a civil engineer who spent his career designing stormwater systems. But on weekends and vacations over 6 years in the late 90s, he built a 3-bedroom cabin on a half-acre lot on the north end of a lake in eastern Washington. He poured the foundation. He framed it. He ran the electrical with a friend's help, put up the drywall, laid the floors, built the wraparound porch that faced the water. By the time it was done, it was one of the best constructed small buildings I've ever been inside. When his wife Patricia died of a stroke in 2015, Dennis moved up there full-time. He said the city apartment felt wrong without her. He said the lake house felt like the place she'd been most herself. The diagnosis came in late September. Pancreatic cancer, stage 3. By late spring, the conversations had shifted from fighting to managing. Dennis went into the facility in early August. He said he didn't want to die at the lake house because he didn't want that to be the memory the place carried. He wanted the house to stay full of light, full of good mornings. So he went in, and I drove up with a duffel bag and told myself I'd stay as long as it took. My nephew Dale, Dennis's only son, said he'd fly in closer to the end. He had work. He had things to handle. He'd be there when it mattered. I've thought about that phrase a lot since, as if the 11 days I spent in that chair beside Dennis's bed, eating from vending machines, sleeping in 2-hour stretches, listening to him breathe through the night, were somehow the preliminary round, as if the important part was still coming. Maybe Dale was just scared. I've tried to give him that, but I've also seen his face go still when a plan fell apart, and I've learned to read what's behind that stillness. I don't think it was fear that kept him away. I think it was calculation. The woman across the hall was named Eleanor Marsh. Not my last name, mine is Calloway. Just a coincidence that made her laugh the first time I told her. I noticed her on my second day. 70s, silver hair pulled back neatly, sitting in her wheelchair by the window with a crossword puzzle book open on the tray table. She was doing it in pen. No visitors that first day, none the second, none the third. Day 4, I grabbed 2 coffees from the family kitchen and knocked on her open door. She looked up from the crossword with an expression I can only describe as assessing, running some quiet calculation before deciding how to proceed. Then she said, "Come in then." Sharp woman, dry sense of humor, the kind earned over decades. Retired bookkeeper, 31 years at the same firm. 2 children, a son named Gary who lived 20 minutes away, a daughter in Phoenix. Her husband Harold had died in 2009. She'd sold the family house 2 years later and moved to a smaller place. I asked about Gary. She said he was busy. Said it without inflection, the way you say something you've already finished grieving. I came back the next morning, and the morning after that, blueberry muffins from the volunteer cart. We talked about her grandkids, about Dennis, about the facility's truly terrible decaf. She asked good questions, the kind where you'd finished answering before you realized how much you'd said. I mentioned Dale a few times, that he was flying in to handle the estate while I handled things at Dennis's bedside. Eleanor would nod, and I didn't think anything of it. Dennis wasn't sleeping well. Morphine kept him drifting. Some nights he'd talk in fragments, names, old arguments, half sentences that went nowhere. I sat with him through most of it. One night he was more agitated than usual. He said Dale's name twice and then said, "I should have been clearer. I should have put it in writing more clearly." I asked what he meant. He settled back and closed his eyes and didn't answer. I filed it away as the kind of thing people say when they're on morphine and afraid. I didn't take it out and examine it the way I should have. I want to pause here and tell you about the 11 days I spent inside that facility before Dale arrived, because those days are not just context. They are the reason I was ready when it mattered. Hospice care has a particular quality of time. The days don't feel like regular days. They feel longer and shorter simultaneously. Long because you are waiting, always waiting, tracking every small shift in breathing and color and the quality of consciousness in the person you love. Short because you understand, with a clarity you can't quite access in ordinary life, that the number of them is finite and contracting. I had lived 57 years without understanding what it felt like to have that kind of clarity. I understand it now. My days had a structure. I would arrive in Dennis's room around 7 in the morning and stay until somewhere past midnight, breaking for meals in the cafeteria and for the walks I took when the walls started to press in. The nurses rotated in 8-hour shifts, and I learned their names and their rhythms. There was a day nurse named Valeria who had been working in palliative care for 16 years and who possessed the particular gift of being exactly present without being intrusive. She would check Dennis's vitals with her hand briefly on his arm, speaking softly to him even when he wasn't tracking, because she said that hearing was often the the last thing to go, and that being spoken to with warmth, even unconsciously, was something the body registered. There was a night nurse named Thomas who would sometimes sit with me for 10 minutes on his break and ask about Dennis, not the medical details, but the man, who he'd been, what he'd built, what he cared about. He said he'd been doing this work for 12 years, and he still believed the dying person's life deserved to be present in the room, not just their condition. I told him about the lake house and the porch and the vegetable garden. Thomas said, "He sounds like a man who understood the value of visible effort." The cafeteria closed at 8, but there was a family kitchen with a coffee machine and a volunteer cart. I lived largely on that cart for 11 days. Peanut butter crackers, granola bars, the muffins I began splitting with Eleanor every morning. It occurs to me now that one of the things that drove me down the hall with 2 coffees on the 4th morning was simply the need to do something for someone. When everything around you is beyond your capacity to fix, the small acts of provision, a coffee, a muffin, a brief conversation, take on a weight they don't normally carry. They become the evidence you're still useful, still present, still capable of some form of care. Eleanor understood this without my saying it. On the 5th morning, she looked at me and said, "You look like a man who needs to be doing something." I said I felt that way. She said, "Then keep coming. I have no shortage of crossword clues I could use a second opinion on." We developed a routine. I would come in with the coffees and the muffins, and she would have the crossword open to a specific entry she'd been stuck on, and we would work through it together. I am not particularly good at crosswords, but Eleanor was patient with my wrong answers in a way that suggested she'd had plenty of practice. We would talk about the clue, then about whatever the clue reminded one of us of, then about that thing and wherever it led. The kind of conversation that has no agenda and no terminus, possible only when 2 people have nowhere urgent to be. I told her things about my life I hadn't talked about in years, about my first marriage, which ended when I was 32, about the work I'd done, the choices I'd made, the particular loneliness of being someone's younger brother when the older one is dying. She listened with the complete attention she brought to everything, and she asked questions that showed she'd been listening, specific questions, the kind that reference an exact detail from 20 minutes earlier, the kind that make you feel like what you said mattered enough to be held. She told me things too, about Harold, who had been a quiet man with a loud laugh and a gift for woodworking, about the house they'd lived in for 37 years, the one she'd had to sell, though she didn't say yet what had made that necessary, about the things she wished she'd said to people when she'd had the chance, and the things she'd said that she wished she could take back, and about learning to tell the difference in retrospect. She said, "One of the strange gifts of ending up somewhere like this is that you get very clear, eventually, about which regrets are real and which ones are just noise." I asked her what the difference was. She said, "The real ones involve other people. The noise ones involve yourself." Every regret she had that involved only herself, the career choice she'd second-guessed, the trip she'd never taken, those had gone quiet over the years, lost their power. But the ones that involved what she had or hadn't said to another person, what she'd seen and looked away from, what she'd let happen because saying something would have been uncomfortable, those were as vivid as the day they happened. I have thought about that distinction every day since she said it. The night before Dale was due in, I couldn't sleep. Dennis had been quieter than usual. The nurses told me this was normal at this stage, a kind of gathering. His breathing had a new quality, slower and more deliberate. I sat with him until almost midnight, and then I needed to move. I walked the hallway. Eleanor's light was on. She waved me in. She said she'd heard me on the phone that evening. I'd been in the family lounge going over the list with Dale, the deed to the lake house, the investment paperwork, the insurance documents. Dennis wanted everything ready while he could still sign. I'd told Dale exactly what to bring. Eleanor went quiet. Then she said, "Your nephew called this facility today, twice. He asked the nurses station whether your brother was still considered competent to sign legal documents." I stared at her. She said, "I heard it from the nurse who took the second call. She mentioned it in the hallway. I don't think anyone thought I was listening." I asked when. "Mid-morning," she said. "Around 10, before I'd called Dale to say things were getting close." I tried to make it innocent. Dale was organized, proactive, maybe just planning ahead. Eleanor said, "Maybe, but he called asking whether your brother could still legally sign before you told him it was urgent." Then she said something I've thought about every day since. She said, "I had a son once who I trusted completely. Look at every page of every document before you sign anything. If someone is in a hurry to get your signature, that is the moment to slow down." I thanked her. I went back to Dennis's room and sat in the dark and told myself I was exhausted and reading into things. I didn't sleep. By 4 in the morning, I had stopped trying. I sat with my brother and thought about what Eleanor had said and thought about what Dennis had said the other night. I should have been clearer. And thought about the way he'd looked at me the day before when Dale's name came up. Not nervous, exactly. Something more careful than nervous. The look of a man who is weighing what to say and deciding against most of it. At some point, a nurse came in to check Dennis's vitals and mentioned, cheerfully, that my nephew had called ahead and confirmed he'd be in by 11. He'd asked them to have a meeting room reserved. She said it like it was good news, like family coordinating around a difficult time was a kindness. I nodded and thanked her and sat there thinking about a meeting room reserved before the flight had even landed. Dale showed up at 10:50. I heard him coming, rolling luggage on institutional tile, his easy, confident voice down the hall saying something to the nurses' station. He'd always had that quality, even as a teenager, a smoothness that I'd thought at the time time was charisma. He came around the corner and hugged me, and it lasted a beat longer than felt natural. He smelled like airport and good aftershave. Charcoal jacket, salt and pepper at the temples. He said, "Uncle Marsh, I'm so sorry. I got here as fast as I could." He sat with Dennis for about 40 minutes. He held his father's hand, talked quietly, said the right things. Dennis drifted in and out. Once he turned his head toward Dale and seemed to focus, and Dale leaned in close and said something I couldn't hear. Dennis closed his eyes. Then he turned his head toward me. He looked at me for a few seconds. Really looked. Not the drifting morphine gaze, but something clearer. His lips moved slightly. I leaned in but couldn't make out words. He squeezed my hand once, briefly, and then the focus drifted out again. I've thought about that look every day since. I think he was trying to pass something to me in those few seconds. A warning or a permission. I don't know. I didn't know then. Dale suggested we get coffee and talk through next steps. He bought 2 coffees without asking how I took mine. He laid the folder on the cafeteria table with his hands flat on top of it, the gesture of a man presenting something orderly and reasonable. He said, "Dad's been worried about the house. He wanted to make sure it was handled cleanly, not tied up in probate for 18 months while lawyers eat the equity. So we've put together a quit-claim deed transferring the property directly to me. I can handle the sale, cover his final expenses, and distribute what's left the way he wanted. A private notary is coming this afternoon at 2. We just need your signature as witness." I said I'd like to read the paperwork first. He said, "Of course, standard language, but we don't have a lot of time." He slid the deed across the table. I read it. Then I turned to the second page, and the third. Behind the deed were 2 other documents. The second was a durable power of attorney making Dale the sole agent over all of Dennis's financial affairs, effective immediately, no expiration date, no co-agent. It covered bank accounts, investment accounts, real property, everything. The third was a life insurance beneficiary designation form, a policy I hadn't known existed through Dennis's old union, $430,000. The current beneficiary's name had been partially obscured in the photocopy. Dale's name was typed cleanly in the new beneficiary line. I set the papers down. I said, "What are these other 2 documents?" He said, "Protective measures, in case Dad's situation changes in the next few days. The power of attorney lets me manage his affairs without going back for additional signatures." I said, "Who is the current beneficiary on the insurance?" He said, "It was Carol, but Carol agreed to this. We talked. Carol is my sister, Dennis's daughter." In 11 days of phone calls, I'd spoken to her 4 times, and she had never mentioned any conversation with Dale about insurance or the house. I said, "When did Carol agree to this?" He said, "A few weeks ago. She's on board." I said I'd like to speak with Carol before signing anything. Something shifted in his face. Subtle. Dale had always been good at keeping his face doing the right things, but there was a tightening around the eyes, a quality of recalibration, like a machine processing an unexpected input. He said, "You're exhausted. You're grieving. That's why I'm here, to handle this so you don't have to. You just need to witness 1 document." I said, "I'd still like to speak with Carol." Dale said he didn't have Carol's current number handy. She'd changed it recently. He'd get it to me later after the notary came, after everything was handled. I said, "I have Carol's number." I stood up and walked out of the cafeteria and called Patrice Hollander. Dennis had given me her number on a Sunday afternoon in June, on the porch of the lake house when he was still strong enough to be outside. He'd said, "Patrice has handled my affairs for 15 years. She knows exactly what I want. If anything goes sideways, if you're ever sitting across from someone and something feels off, call her first, before you sign anything." I'd thought he was just being careful. It was one of the things I loved about him. Patrice answered on the 3rd ring. I told her what was on the table. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marshall, none of that is consistent with Dennis's will. The lake house is to be sold and split equally 3 ways. Dale, Carol, and you. The life insurance has always been designated to Carol, and Dennis has never asked me to change it. I have not been consulted about any power of attorney." I said, "Who would have prepared these documents?" She said, "Not me." "Marshall, photograph those documents right now and send them to me. And do not sign anything." I walked back into the cafeteria. Dale had refilled his coffee. He was sitting with his hands folded on the table, the folder in front of him, the pen moved to one side and ready. His expression was set to patient and understanding. I sat down. I said, "I just spoke to Patrice Hollander." His face did the thing I'd seen it do before, the micro-stillness, the recalibration, but this time it went further. The ease drained out entirely. What was underneath was not the face I'd known for 40 years. I said, "She's never been consulted about any of this. The will says the house splits 3 ways. The insurance has always been Carol's. None of what you've brought is what Dennis asked for." Dale said nothing. Then, "Patrice doesn't have the full picture." I said, "He gave me her number in June, specifically. He told me to call her first if anything felt wrong." The jaw tightened. He said, "There are things about Dad's financial situation you don't know. Debts he was too proud to tell you about. I've been covering things for 2 years. I deserve to be made whole. This is just a clean way to do it." I said, "If there are debts, they'll be handled through probate like everything else." He said, "Probate takes 18 months and eats half the value." I said, "Dale, I'm not signing anything." He looked at me across the table. I watched him run through a sequence: argument, appeal, pressure, and discard each one. He'd counted on 2 things: my grief making me careless and my love for him making me trusting. He'd been right about both for most of my life. He'd just run the calculation on the wrong day. He picked up the folder. He stood up. He said, "You're making a mistake." I said, "I don't think so." He left. I sat there with the cold coffee and called Carol. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything. When I got to the beneficiary change, she went quiet for a long moment. Then she said, he called me once, maybe 2 months ago. Said there might be some routine paperwork that he'd have Patrice send it to me. I never heard anything else. I never agreed to anything. She cried a little. She said, is Dad okay? I said he was the same. I said the notary wasn't coming. I said everything was still the way Dennis had intended. She said she was going to book a flight. I went back upstairs. I stopped at Eleanor's door. She looked up from her crossword. I said, you were right. She nodded once. The nod of a woman who has known for a long time how these things tend to go. I said, I called the attorney. Everything he had was fabricated. She said, good, you looked. Then she said, after a moment, I hope he comes back up to see his father. I said, I don't know if he will. She said, no, I don't suppose you do. I sat with her longer than usual that day. We didn't talk about Dale or the documents. She told me about a trip she and Harold had taken in 1987, a long weekend at a rented cottage on the Oregon coast. It had rained the entire time and they'd never been happier. She said there was a lesson in that somewhere, but she'd never been able to articulate it precisely. Maybe it was just that good company makes the weather irrelevant. Dennis died the following morning at 6:14. Carol was on one side of his bed and I was on the other. The light coming in was the gray-blue of very early morning. He went gently. Dale was not there. He sent a text to Carol's phone at 8:30 that said, heard from the facility. I'm sorry. I'll reach out soon. He didn't reach out for 11 days. The week after the funeral, Carol and I sat down with Patrice. She'd reviewed photographs of the documents. She walked us through what she'd found. The quitclaim deed had been properly formatted and notarized by a notary of Dale's choosing at some point before the hospice visit, but Dennis had never signed it. It was a document waiting for a signature. If I'd signed as witness without reading carefully, and if Dennis had been presented with it in a state of diminished capacity and signed where Dale told him to, the transfer would likely have been legally valid and effectively irreversible. The durable power of attorney had been prepared by a document preparation service, not an attorney. It was technically compliant, but Dennis had never been consulted, and at his level of medical decline, the signing would have been challengeable. But challenging it would have required time and money and energy that Dale had probably counted on us not having. The life insurance beneficiary form was the most straightforward piece. Dale had obtained it directly from the union's benefits administrator by calling as Dennis's authorized representative, a claim he had no legal basis to make. He had prepared the change of beneficiary form himself. It had not been signed by Dennis. It was a document designed to be slipped into a stack of legitimate paperwork in a moment of grief and trust. Carol asked, what was the total exposure? Patrice looked at her legal pad. She said, the property value was approximately $750,000. The liquid assets were close to $240,000. The insurance policy was $430,000. Total, somewhere north of $1.4 million. We sat with that. Carol asked about prosecution. Patrice said it depended on how much we wanted to spend and how much damage we could tolerate. The documents hadn't been executed. No money had moved. The most actionable element was the fraudulent claim to the union administrator, but proving intent versus carelessness was a complicated and costly road. She said civil remedies were more accessible than criminal ones, but that pursuing a family member civilly was a long, expensive process with an uncertain outcome. She said, I want to be clear you have options. I also want to be clear that I've seen families destroyed by the legal pursuit of things like this as surely as by the theft itself. Carol and I talked for 2 hours afterward in a diner across the street. She said she kept trying to understand when Dale had become capable of this. She said she'd always found him a little opaque, polished in a way that kept you from seeing inside, but had never thought it meant this. I said, I think he was in a difficult financial situation, and he saw an opportunity and took it further than he should have. Carol said, it makes it worse, actually, that it was just money. It's so small. We decided not to pursue criminal charges. We filed a formal complaint with the union benefits administrator. We had Patrice document everything and notify Dale, through her, that we were aware of what he'd attempted and that any further action against the estate would result in immediate legal action. Dale's response, he denied fraudulent intent and believed there had been a miscommunication about what Dennis had wanted. He said he'd been trying to help. Carol put the response down on her kitchen table and said, I want you to know that I am never going to stop being furious about the word miscommunication. The estate settled 8 months later. The lake house sold in early spring to a couple from Seattle, a retired teacher and a graphic designer with 2 teenagers who wanted summers on the water. At the closing, when the keys changed hands, the woman squeezed her husband's arm and said, I can't believe we get to live here. It hit me like a fist in the sternum, but in a good way. It was exactly what Dennis had wanted. The place going to people who would love it. Carol and I split the proceeds with Dale per the terms of the will. It was what Dennis had asked for, and it was what we were going to do regardless. Carol said, Dad trusted us with his wishes. We're going to honor them. She said it simply, without drama, and I thought it was one of the best sentences I'd heard in a long time. I went back to the facility the following Saturday. I'd bought a box of pastries from the bakery Carol mentioned and written a card. I didn't know exactly what to say, so I wrote the truth, that what Eleanor had told me in that hallway had changed the last weeks of my brother's life, and that I was grateful in a way I didn't have adequate words for. The nurse at the front desk recognized me. Her face changed when I said Eleanor's name. Eleanor had died on Thursday, 2 days earlier, in her sleep. asleep quietly. The nurse went to the back and returned with an envelope, my name on the front in thin, careful handwriting. She said Eleanor had left it at the desk on Wednesday morning and told them, if he comes back, give it to him. If he doesn't, throw it out. I took it outside and sat on a bench near the entrance. I opened it. Inside was a single folded page. It said, Marshall, I don't know if you listened to me. I hope you did. My son's name is Gary. He is 44 years old. He has 2 boys I love very much, and he is the reason I am ending my life in a hospice room instead of the house I lived in for 37 years, and I have made my peace with both of those things, or I am close enough to peace that I can no longer tell the difference. I had a sister-in-law who watched Gary for a long time. She knew, or suspected, and said nothing because she told herself it wasn't her place. She told me this after everything had happened. When I finally asked her directly, she said, I didn't think it was my business. She meant it kindly. She thought staying out of it was a form of respect. I have thought about that a great deal, about all the moments when a person sees something and decides to look away because speaking up is awkward or presumptuous or not their business. About how those small decisions accumulate into an outcome no one chose out loud, but everyone built together brick by keeping quiet. I chose not to keep quiet with you. I don't know if that's courage or just the freedom of having very little left to lose, but I want you to know why I said something. It is because no one said anything to me. Whatever happened, I hope your brother's wishes are intact. I hope you are all right. Esther Eleanor Marsh. I sat on that bench for a long time. A nurse came out and asked if I was all right. I told her yes, I was just sitting for a while. I thought about Dennis pressing Patrice's number into my hand on a sunny porch in June. The careful way he'd chosen his words, the look on his face. I understood now that he'd been afraid, and that he'd been trying to build the smallest possible safety net without saying directly what he was afraid of. Maybe he couldn't say it out loud. Maybe naming it would have made it real in a way he wasn't ready for. I thought about Eleanor's grandsons, the loud middle schoolers she'd described with exhaustion and fondness, going to school every day, not knowing what their father had done, not knowing what their grandmother had lost, and why, and what she had chosen to do about it. She had nothing left to protect and every reason to look away. She had sat in a hallway at midnight and flagged down a stranger and told him the one thing he needed to hear. Then she had gone back to her room and done her crossword and waited to see what he'd do with it. I folded the letter back into the envelope. I put it in my inside jacket pocket. I've kept it there ever since. I also want to tell you about what happened in the months after the estate settled, because the story doesn't end with Dale picking up his folder and leaving the cafeteria. That was a resolution of only one layer. There were other layers underneath it that took longer to sort through. Dale and I did not speak for 4 months after Dennis died. His email to Carol, the one about the miscommunication, went unanswered. He tried calling me once in November, and I let it go to voicemail, and the voicemail said he thought it would be good to talk and that he hoped I was doing well and that family was important to him. I listened to it twice and deleted it. In December, Carol called me and said, I think I need to decide what I'm going to do about Dale, and I don't think I can decide in isolation. So we talked about it. For a long time on multiple calls, in the halting and recursive way that conversations about difficult things actually happen, not linear, not resolved, circling back on the same points from different angles, accumulating weight without arriving cleanly anywhere. Carol said she was angry, and that she expected to be angry for a long time, and that she thought that was appropriate. She said she was also sad in a way that was distinct from the grief about Dennis, a different kind of loss, the loss of who she'd believed Dale was. She said, I keep thinking that somewhere inside the person who brought those documents into a hospice room is still my brother. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if that's a useful thing to believe, but it's what I keep coming back to. I said I understood. I said I kept thinking about the 20-year-old Dale I'd watched grow up at 100 family dinners. I had trouble squaring that person with the man across the cafeteria table, not because I doubted what had happened, the evidence was unambiguous, but because the distance between who someone used to be and who they've become is one of the hardest things to hold in your mind all at once. Carol said, do you think he would have actually gone through with it if you hadn't stopped it? I thought about that for a while. I said, yes, I think he would have. I think he'd convinced himself it was justified, that the debts were real, that Dennis would have agreed, that the family would get over it. I think people who do things like this almost never think of themselves as doing something wrong. They think they're solving a problem. Carol said, that's the part I can't forgive, not the act exactly. The story he told himself that made the act possible. I didn't have an answer to that. I still don't. What I did in January was write Dale a letter, not through Patrice, not with any legal purpose, a personal letter. I told him that I loved him, and that what he had tried to do in that cafeteria was a profound betrayal of every person in that room, including Dennis. I told him that I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I told him I wasn't sure what family meant between us going forward, but that I was willing to find out if he was, and that it would have to start with honesty about what had actually happened and what he'd actually intended. He didn't write back for 6 weeks. When he did, the letter was 2 pages. The first page was various forms of not quite admitting what he'd done, language about intentions and context and a difficult financial period, and how the plan had evolved past what he'd originally intended. The second page was different. In the second page, he said, I knew what I was doing. I told myself a lot of things, but I knew. I'm sorry for doing it, and I'm sorry for what it's cost all of us. I read that letter 4 times. I put it in the drawer with Eleanor's. I haven't decided yet what comes after this with Dale. Carol has a similar unresolved file. We've both talked to him briefly, functionally, once about a tax matter related to the estate, once about our parents' old photographs that Dennis had been keeping. The calls are civil and careful, and have the quality of conversations between people trying to figure out whether there is still a road between them, or whether the bridge has been out too long to rebuild. I think there might be a road. I think that's Carol's decision more than mine, and I intend to support whatever she concludes. It's been 2 years now since Dennis died. I'm back in my own life in most of the ways that count. Back at work, back in my routine, back in the house where I've lived for 22 years. Carol and I talk most Sundays. She sends me pictures of her kids. Her older one, Maddie, who's 13 now, has started asking questions about great Uncle Dennis, and Carol's been showing her pictures of the lake house and telling her about the porch and the mornings there. I like that the place lives on in the telling, even though it's passed to people who love it and should. About 6 months after the estate settled, I got a call from a woman named Frances. Her mother was in a memory care facility. Her brother had taken their mother to an attorney during a period when she'd been assessed as having diminished capacity, documented in the medical records, and had her sign a revised trust agreement removing Frances and her siblings as beneficiaries, replacing them with the brother alone. Frances had been trying to find someone who'd been through something similar. We talked for almost 2 hours. I told her everything. The documents, the notary, Patrice, the letter from Eleanor. I told her to call her mother's estate attorney before she did anything else. I told her to document every conversation, every visit, every phone call, dates and times and exact words. I told her the people pushing hardest for speed were the ones to slow down the most. She said, I keep telling myself maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he really does have an arrangement I don't know about. Maybe Mom did want this. I said, if she wanted it, there will be paperwork from before her capacity changed, prepared by her own attorney with no one else in the room. If there isn't, you already have your answer. She called back 2 weeks later. She'd found a probate attorney pursuing a petition to invalidate the trust amendment on grounds of undue influence and lack of capacity. I've had 3 conversations like that one since. Different nephews, different powers of attorney, different sets of documents prepared by someone close enough to be trusted. Each time the same basic architecture, proximity, access, urgency, a request for a signature before the window closes. I don't think it's rare. I think it happens in families that love each other and in families that barely function, and in all the complicated arrangements in between. Grief makes people vulnerable in ways that are predictable and exploitable, and there are people who understand this and act on it, and they are not always strangers. The things I've learned, for whatever they're worth. If someone wants your signature before you've had time to read something, that is the document to read most carefully. If someone tells you the person who knows the full legal picture doesn't need to be consulted, call that person. If someone says the other heirs have agreed to something, ask the other heirs. If the people pushing you are in a hurry, slow down. And if someone in a hallway, a tired woman doing a crossword puzzle in pen, a stranger with nothing left to lose, stops you at midnight and tells you to look at everything before you sign anything, listen to her. She has probably earned that knowledge the hard way, and she is spending something real to give it to you. I drive past the facility sometimes when I'm in the area. Eleanor's room is on the 2nd floor, corner window facing the parking lot. I look up at it when I drive past. I don't know exactly what I'm doing when I do that. Paying respects, maybe. Acknowledging a debt I can't repay to someone who wouldn't have wanted repayment anyway. She'd made her peace with what she had, and what she had at the end was a window, a crossword book, and the knowledge that she'd said the one thing that needed to be said. I kept her letter. I've shared it, with her daughter's permission, when it seemed like the right thing to put in front of someone who needed to understand that looking away isn't neutral, that not saying something is itself a choice, that the cost of being wrong when you speak up is a little awkwardness, and the cost of being right when you don't is somebody's whole life. Eleanor Marsh decided in the last weeks of hers that somebody's whole life was worth the awkwardness. I try every day to make the same decision.